I have always been blown away by this amazing planet that we live on. 71% of our beautiful world is water. Water is literally all around us. We drink it, we wash in it, we even swim in it. It is a vital part of the world as it is currently designed. So it has always sparked my interest and curiosity to think of places that we have a severe lack of water. I'm from Utah, and all throughout my schooling I was told that I live in a desert, a land that the Native Americans would have had to survive in. And as you continue out west in Utah, you eventually stumble upon a place called the Bonneville Salt Flats. The Bonneville Salt Flats have become a location for many speed competitions due to the flat area that the salt provides. However, you probably know it better as a place that's become a location for breathtaking photos, as well as film locations for blockbuster films. Blockbuster films like Pirates of the Caribbean. In that film, the Salt Flats had been depicted as Davy Jones' locker. But how did this get here? How is there just such a flat, barren space just sitting in the middle of Utah? Well, 20,000 years ago, Jack Sparrow's ship in Pirates of the Caribbean would have been floating in a lake, and this lake at its deepest point was around 980 feet deep. Yes, that's right. The Salt Flats are actually the floor of an ancient lake. This ancient lake was actually one of many lakes in the Great Basin area. And what did they call this lake? Well, just like the Bonneville Salt Flats have their name, it was called Lake Bonneville. The Bonneville Salt Flats are not the only thing left behind by Lake Bonneville. In fact, one of the most well-known things left behind is our very own Great Salt Lake, a lake that is large on its own right. Many other things were left behind as well, but first it's time to rewind the clock and go back to where this all began. And in this case, it all began in a little place called Idaho. So let's zoom in to Idaho, where the first domino that caused the lake would fall. Almost 55,000 years ago, a volcano in Idaho would divert the Bear River. The Bear River used to flow north into the Snake River. Just east of where the Bear River passes Soda Springs, it used to continue east through where Lava Hot Springs now sits. The river would connect to the Portneuf River. After a volcanic eruption took place in the area close to Soda Springs, it would then divert towards the south, but began to flow into the Salt Lake Basin. As water flowed into the Salt Lake Basin, it began to form into a lake, much like the Great Salt Lake. This lake was also the beginning of Lake Bonneville. Now, this was one of a few things that set the stage for how Lake Bonneville was able to grow. And around 20,000 years ago, the climate in the Great Basin region was much cooler and wetter. Most of the Great Basin does not have outlets to the ocean. So at this time, several freshwater lakes were beginning to form. The largest of these lakes would be Lake Bonneville. Now, the rise of Lake Bonneville took some time. For almost 10,000 years, the lake would have fluctuated nearly the size of the current Great Salt Lake. Almost 30,000 years ago, the water began to rise. At about 25,000 years ago, the water settled at the Stansbury shoreline. This would mark a location where the water would sit for a short while. Then later it continued to rise up to about 18,000 years ago. At that point, it began to level out, eventually reaching its tallest point and settling around what we call the Bonneville shoreline. The lake would have continued to grow, however, but it couldn't because of the lowest point in the area, known as Red Rock Pass. The height of the water would overflow. This was the deepest lake Bonneville would ever get. This Bonneville shoreline depth wouldn't last long, however, due to the natural dam failure. Remember Red Rock Pass? Well, the ground in the area wasn't the most stable. What would have began as a small overflow slowly grew into what we call the Bonneville flood. The water eventually overtook the walls of the dam and then quickly and quite viciously began to flow into the Snake River. Water began pouring out into the Snake River and then the Columbia River, which would eventually get to the Pacific Ocean. The flood would have only lasted a short time, months if not weeks. Water from the lake would continue to flow through Red Rock Pass, but eventually the flood would die down and water would flow at a much healthier pace through Red Rock Pass for almost 3,000 years. After those 3,000 years, the level dropped 430 feet. Signs of the flood are best shown at Twin Falls, King Hill Boulder Field, Bruno Sand Dunes, Swan Falls, Celebration Park, and that's just to show a few examples. But let's zoom into Twin Falls. See, at Twin Falls, you can see a large portion of the area where there's no farms. Now, the reason why there's no farms on this strip of area is because as the water began to flow down its natural path, the current river was too small to accommodate the amount of water flowing through. So instead of it flowing down that natural path, it began to divert and go in any way it could to follow the river line. It flowed on this other path that came around, and it was going at such a vicious rate that it actually scraped off the top layer of soil, leaving this big scar on the earth of a place where you simply cannot plant crop. As you continue to go down the river, you'll notice several parts of the river that have been completely carved out. Now, after the flood, the water leveled out at what we call the Provo shoreline. As the climate began to get drier in this area, the water would eventually level out at the current depth of what we see at the Great Salt Lake. Now, this probably sounded much more like a geology lesson than is talking about history. However, these events have shaped Utah in so many ways today. So let's talk about a few of the things that have been left behind from Lake Bonneville and how it's impacted the history of Utah. The first thing we'll talk about is the salt. The salt flats, like I stated before, have housed a number of things from films to speed racing. But why is there so much salt left behind? And what do you do with it? Because this is the closed basin, the water fills up but only leaves through evaporation. This causes the minerals to flow into the Great Salt Lake and not flow out like other lakes. Now that's why there's so much salt. This salt would be used by people for years and years. The Native Americans in the area were the first to utilize the salt. Then later, the pioneers recognized the use for salt in things like mining. Okay, so the next sign of the historic lake is actually on the mountains. 3 main shorelines can be seen on the mountains here in Utah. Although there were more than these 3, these are the most visible. You have the Stansbury, the Provo, and the Bonneville shoreline. The most prominent is the Bonneville shoreline. In fact, a lot of the shoreline has been turned into a hiking trail that if you visit Utah, you can actually go and hike. Several bodies of water have also been left behind. Utah Lake, Lake Sevier, Fish Lake, and of course the Great Salt Lake. The Great Salt Lake is essentially Lake Bonneville. Its shores are the starting point as well as the ending point. However, the name Bonneville refers to when the lake would have encompassed the full area and all the lakes that were left behind. The Great Salt Lake, being the largest left behind, has become a centerpiece of Utah. Those that visit the lake may find their nose being the first thing entertained on their arrival. The lake is shallow and filled with minerals. this high amount of salt makes it so if you go and swim in the Great Salt Lake, you'll actually just float. It also hosts millions of migrant birds. Native Americans called this place home. In fact, some of the largest collections of Native American artifacts have been found around the Great Salt Lake. 2 caves, Danger Cave and Hogup Cave, housed Native Americans and their artifacts for a very long time. Then later, the pioneers settled here and started building water resorts around the lake. Water resorts like the ones I've talked about in previous videos about the Great Saltaire or Lagoon. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about is how the Lake Bonneville got its name. Benjamin Louis Bonneville was a French-born officer in the United States Army, who's also a fur trapper and explorer in the American West. Funny enough, he probably never even saw the Great Salt Lake, or even the Great Basin for that matter. Explorers as early as Captain J.C. Fremont in 1843 recognized shoreline evidence that these shorelines existed in the Great Salt Lake Basin. However, G.K. Gilbert, first with the Wheeler Survey in the 1870s and later with the U.S. Geological Survey, was the first to study these prehistoric lake features and describe the major features of Lake Bonneville. He named the lake after Captain Bonneville, but it was named most likely to pay respect to Bonneville. Gilbert was one of the greatest geologists of the 19th century. So here we are today. It still blows my mind that where I grew up used to be covered in water. Utah is such a beautiful place. Its natural wonders are nearly limitless. So let's cherish this world around us. Let's cherish how it became what it is today. And I feel like the world we live on can be very symbolic of us. The Lake Bonneville flood only happened on this small part of the world. And to some, the scars left behind could be seen as ugly or harsh. But if you take a step back and look at the world we live on, we can't help but say it's beautiful. So, don't get caught up in the little things that you don't think are perfect. Take a step back and realize that we're beautiful.